So, my pleasure is to introduce the presentation, the lecture of Zuliano Federico, who is currently finishing his postdoc position at the University of Turin, and he specializes in the religious minorities of the history of all European period of Reformation and late Renaissance culture. Please.
Okay, do you hear me? Thanks. Okay, so first of all, I would like to thank the organizers of this conference, which is really a pleasure to be here. And I owe a great debt of gratitude to Gregor Bogin for an invitation that honors me greatly. And still, I need to thank especially Jiva Borak for the patience that she has shown while dealing with me and with my many delays. And I'm sorry to say I was with her quite the stereotypical Italian. So, today I'm going to present some pessimistic reflections drawn from personal experience on the problematic status of the biographies of religious and linguistic minorities held in Italian historical research. German-Swiss historiography will be also taken into account. A comparison between these two so very different traditions will allow us to pinpoint further issues not to be seen if investigated independently. Before to dwell upon my paper, I ought to give you some background. A biographical one seems especially in order today. Still, I will try to keep as brief as possible. My main field is 16th century religious history. More specifically, I work on what I call anti-stereotypical minorities, meaning those minorities that seem to challenge, by their own existence, our general understanding of what is the historical character or even the identity of certain populations. Let me ask you, what are Scandinavians historically, from a religious point of view at least? Lutherans is the answer. Therefore, in my first PhD in London, I studied Danish-speaking Catholics. Let me ask you again, what are Greeks? Orthodox. And therefore, in the next years, I plan to undertake the studies of Greek-speaking Catholics and possibly Greek-speaking Muslims. Over the past years, however, and still today, my research has focused instead on Italian-speaking Protestants. Yes, Italy did know a Reformation, although a growing Roman Catholic opposition, in brief, the Inquisition, forced those men and women to either conceal their faith or to leave the country for good. A significant portion of these men and women chose the latter option and fled Italy, spreading all over Europe. My PhD and my hopefully soon-to-be published book deal in particular with 30 Italian-speaking churches that existed between roughly 1545 up to 1620 in the Free State of the Free Leagues, also known as the Grisons, a republic allied to the old Swiss Confederacy, but fiercely independent from it. It was a multifaceted state. In addition to 3 independent leagues, which roughly correspond with the present Swiss canton of Graubünden, since 1514, the Republic ruled over 3 ex-Milanese mandated territories, Valtellina, Valchiavenna, and Bormio. By 1526, and the proclamation of the so-called Articles of Elands, the Grisons became also the first officially biconfessional state in Europe. Every citizen, every subject, every visitor was free to choose his or her own religious confession between Catholicism and the evangelical faith, so meaning Zwinglianism. The Grisons, however, presented a further level of complexity. They were, and they still are, populated by 3 different linguistic groups: Romansch, German, and Italian. My aim was to reconstruct the way in which the Italian-speaking churches and communities actually worked on our everyday base. The perspective was especially socio-historical. However, the general destruction of local ecclesiastical archives has deprived me of the usual sources for this kind of inquiries. Left with only notarial archives and Inquisition materials, I turned to a biographical and prosopographical approach. By reconstructing the lives of singular believers, I gained information of specific institutions. Then, by looking at the lives of groups of individuals, I was able to answer general, broader questions. In doing so, I came to agree with what Carlo Dionisotti once said: "La storia è fatta di uomini, è biografia." History is made of men. It is, therefore, biography. As it often happens, my original intention was different. My idea was to write a book on the 4 years that Pierpaolo Vergerio spent in the Grisons. We have heard this morning of him, but I will give you, for those who don't know him, a short introduction. He was a native of Capodistria Koper, became a papal nuncio, was made bishop of his hometown, then he faced a religious conversion, turned Protestant, fled Italy, worked as a reform minister in the Grisons, and ended up as a special advisor to Duke Christopher of Württemberg, where he collaborated and then quarreled with Primo Struber. While I abandoned Pierpaolo, I never gave up his family. After a few years of research, right now, I'm finally about to publish, so let's hope, a biography on Giovanni Battista Vergerio, a brother of Pierpaolo. He was as well a bishop of Pola Pula, and a Protestant convert himself. Once again, my research mingled with biography as an historical genre. I don't mean it, however, simply because I'm writing a biography, but because the history of the Vergerio brothers is first and foremost the history of a family clan fighting against rival clans for the control of a small provincial town. It is to be understood only by the juxtaposition of the biographies of very different people, from servants to householders, from wives to friends, from allies to enemies. Istria, furthermore, was among the areas of Italy where the Reformation movement was larger and stronger. Much it was due to the activity of the Vergerio brothers. And several conversions were clearly the result of personal connection as much as they were of inner convictions. So, the paper for real. If somebody works on Italian history, and needs to check biographies, he or she has at their disposal an extraordinary instrument, the Dizionario Biographico degli Italiani. It was begun in 1960, was finally finished in 2020. It is no small work. Counts 100 volumes of circa 500 pages each on 2 columns for more than 40,000 entries. One of the characteristics, compared for instance to the Oxford equivalent, is the length of the entries, which is generally a significant one, much larger than other national lexica. We said for more than 40,000 entries, mostly of individuals, and yet sometimes also of families. From many points of view, it can be regarded, the Dizionario, as a mirror of Italian historiography in general. Last but not least, because it was not written or organized by a specific editorial group, but by a collection, a cooperation of historians. Several thousand, if we count the names, ended up writing the Dizionario. Again, as a general rule, the Dizionario is a fantastic resource of high scholarly value. Yet, for me and for my research, it has proven useless. Now, I do not want to bore you to death, but I'm obliged to present at least a few examples to give you at least an idea of how much is actually missing. Families, patrician families, seem a good place where to start, since it is in theory harder to miss them completely. Let's take two of the most important Protestant families from the mandated territories, the Mascaranico from Chiavenna and the Paravicino from Caspano. The Mascaranico were rich merchants with vast, really vast European connections, and rose to the highest possible positions in the regions. Paolo was the founder of the Protestant Church of Chiavenna, but also the dedicatee of a work by the famous Italian polymath Ortensio Lando. Moreover, he was a leading merchant in Lyon. Neither Paolo nor other member of the family got an entry. As for the Paravicino, which had a similar profile, but were actually noblemen, only one member is listed, Giovanni Antonio Paravicini, who belonged to the sole Catholic sub-branch of the clan and would later become a priest and a local chronicle. Coming to Istria, the De Vetter, an important local family that mixed with the Vergerio by marriage and then converted to Protestantism, they are notably absent. Even the very Vergerio are underrepresented. Neither, to give you an example, neither Aurelio Senior nor Aurelio Junior are included. Coming to individuals, the case of Ulisse Martinengo is worth mentioning. He was the son of one of the most prestigious families from Brescia, and indeed more than 20 close relatives of his are included in the Dizionario. A man of many qualities and exquisite education, he converted, moved to Sondrio, and became the leader and patron not simply of the local community, but of the whole Reformation movement in the Grisons. His name is actually mentioned in the correspondence of, among others, Jean Calvin, Théodore de Bèze, Heinrich Bullinger. Nor he went unnoticed to scholars. Alessandro Pastore, Cesare Vasoli studied him in detail. Later on, Achille Oliveri published a 40 pages long article on him. Yet, he was forgotten by the editors of the Biographical. The list could go on. I will give you also more examples later on. But what I want to face now is that the absence, actually, of 16th century Protestant might sound quite distant and, let's face it, inconsequential for general historical research. Yet, the systematic absence in the Dizionario of 19th and 20th century Valdensians convinced the Società di Studi Valdesi to publish its own Dizionario Biographico dei Protestanti Italiani, with a very polemical, clearly polemical pun in the title. If we compare the entries, we realize of what the main Biographico has left out, of how important were some characters. We are left to wonder if it was due to somehow the resurface of stereotypes, of those old stereotypes that perceive Protestants as a foreign element in Italian history and Italian society, on the contrary of other minorities, as for instance Jews, but very similar, and I can't speak of this now, of Greek Orthodox Italians, which equally are absent in the dictionary. That it was due to what we could call a blindness. That this was due to what we could call a blindness seems confirmed when realizing that actually not all Italian Protestants are absent by the Biographical. On the contrary, we find entries for almost all those that modern scholars called Italian heretics, namely Anabaptists, anti-Trinitarians, and Socinians. To mention some names active in the Grisons, Niccolò Camogli, Bartolomeo Silvio, Camillo Renato, the mysterious Tiziano. To give you an idea of the extent of their presence, I will go back to one of the local families from the mandated territories, the Pestalozzi, once again, very rich, very prestigious, very important. Only one member of them is included in the Dizionario, and is Fabrizio, who is known to us for one reason and one reason only. Because at one point, when he was a young apprentice, lost in Krakow, wrote a letter to his former minister in Chiavenna explaining the reasons why he had decided to convert to anti-Trinitarism. And it's all. Their presence in the Dizionario is due to Delio Cantimori, one of the fathers of contemporary Italian historiography. Cantimori devoted to the Eretici Italiani his most influential book, which was published in 1939. Such men, who Cantimori described, and I quote, rebels to any church, were favorably received almost as heroic models in the Italian secular and anti-clerical milieu of the 1940s and 1950s, when Christian democracy was the hegemonic party in Italy. Later on, in the 1970s, these heretics kept being read as positive examples, although this time of left-wing anti-systemic political activity, terrorism included. In other words, the inclusion has almost nothing to do with their actual religious affiliation. This seems the best moment to look briefly at the project description that the editorial Bird published in 2014, when the Dizionario, not yet completed, went online. It's a very short one, but these few lines still are most telling for what they say, and even more for what they don't say. The word nation is absent, substituted those two times where it's absolutely needed by the neutral paese, country. When the adjective national is used, it is actually put into brackets and diluted by the adverb potenzialmente, a potentially national history, una storia potenzialmente nazionale. There is then no mention of neither religion nor language. It speaks, this presentation, of Italians as a collective, and of the work as a collective history of Italians. But then the question stands, and must stand, who is or was an Italian? The editorial board was clearly cautious. And this does not come as a surprise. The Dizionario is published by the same institution which edited between 1932 and 1936 the Encyclopedia Italiana, the cultural pinnacle of nationalistic and fascist Italian culture in the 1920s and 30s. The Encyclopedia was intended as both a scholarly work and a political weapon. It was, for instance, the place where the Italianità, the Italians, of certain territories was claimed on scientific and sometimes, quite often, pseudoscientific reasons. It was, for instance, the case for Corsica, for Dalmatia, the Grisons. It is not surprising, then, that in a democratic, some way anti-nationalistic Italy, certain entries which were present in the Encyclopedia were quietly dropped. Entries such as the Planta and the Salis families from Engadin on one end, or, for instance, the entry on Matthias Flacius Illyricus. Yet, some considerations are in order. Both Planta and Salis families were from Engadin, but they were highly Italianized. We have documents, and all the male members wrote and speak, we know for sure, in Italian. Only the women use Retro-Romansch. But most important, the great majority of their members lived for long periods of times in Italy as merchants, as diplomats, as mercenaries. Even more importantly, both families had branches that had left Engadin and settled in Italy, in Italian-speaking territories, such as in Soglio, which now is in Switzerland, and in Chiavenna, in Italy. Their absence in the Dizionario did indeed prevent improper claims of Italianità, but in doing so, the Dizionario made completely lost the role that many of the members of these families played in Italian history. The fear of being somehow accused of cultural appropriation, because I can't find any other reason, was so strong that even the Count Ulisse Salic never got an entry. Ulisse Salic was actually born in Italy, in Tirano, was a man of strong Mazzinian ideas, fought in the Italian Wars of Independence, was imprisoned by the Austrians at the Kufstein, was a hero, but no entry for him. And I have no time to go on to linger on the subject, no space for other Romansch speakers. But let's turn to Flacius Illyricus. He was from Labin, Albona, a Croatian-speaking center in Inner Istria, and would later become a European figure thanks to his scholarly work and his vigorous Gnesian Lutheranism. Yet, he was born a Venetian subject, was highly influenced by an Italian uncle, Blado Lupetino, studied in Padua. Moreover, he did, when he could not write in Latin, we know that he used Italian. Even more importantly, even if he spent most of his adult life in Germany, he kept in contact and contributed to the Reformation movement in northern Italy. As said, he was given an entry in the Encyclopedia Italiana, where casually no mention of a Croatian origin or the fact that he spoke Croatian was made. Not in the Dizionario. The short project description claims that the works include people who were either born in Italy or were active in Italy. So we are left to wonder, is the fact that the mother tongue of Flacius Illyricus, his mother tongue was not Italian, was it enough to claim that Flacius had no role whatsoever in Italian history? Is it enough to accept that, in a way, belongs entirely to another word, another tradition? An additional problem that is connected with expunging famous and, of course, problematic figures, such as, for instance, Flacius, is that this set the example for smaller ones. I don't think they have the time, but we could do the examples of the Istrian Croatians. Lorenzo Millamanzio was a better example because he spent all his life in the Grisons, serving an Italian-speaking community as a minister, is not mentioned. Okay. Still, once again, 16th century examples seem so remote, so inconsequential. But what about those Slovenians who were often born in what today is Italy, lived a significant, if not all of their life in Italy, opposed fascism, were persecuted, sometimes killed by fascist authorities? Didn't they play a role in Italian history, and shouldn't they be included in the Dizionario? Apparently not. As such, Josip Ferfoglia was born in Deberdov del Lago, died in Trieste, no entry. Lavo Cermegli, born in Trieste, no entry. Angelo Cucagna, born and died in Trieste, no entry. Pinko Tomajic, once again born in Trieste, shot by a firing squad in Opicina after being tried by a special fascist tribunal, no entry. The list, again, could go on. I'm forced to ask you again, what makes an Italian? Is speaking a minority language enough to claim that somebody had no part in Italian history? Isn't it possible, for instance, to be two things at the same time? Isn't it possible to play a role in a national history, even if this person challenges that very idea of a nation? And very briefly, the Swiss part. During my researches, I've weighted heavily also on Swiss history. In Switzerland, a true biographical dictionary has never been published. However, a new Historisches Lexikon der Schweiz appeared in 2002. I quote it in German, but appeared also in Italian and French. While looking for Italian-speaking Protestants active in the Grisons in the Lexikon, when we look at them, the Lexikon presents many who are actually absent in the Biographical. However, it offers profiles which are so short that they are hardly of any use, despite signalizing the actual existence, the actual importance of somebody. Things are drastically different as we turn to a kind of scholarly work that encapsulate a specific German and German-Swiss tradition of biographical research. the edition of correspondence of reformers. Here, at least, as Italian Protestants are mentioned in the letters, they all deserve proper biographies. In the still going edition of the Bullinger correspondence in the Heinrich Bullinger Werke, the biographies are inserted in the notes. In the previous Bullinger's correspondence mit den Graubünden, the biographies have a section of their own at the beginning, and they run often for many pages. But here come the problems. The authors of such biographies are generally specialized in the field of Protestant theology and Reformation history, yet they are no expert of Italian history per se. Never ever they have seen an archive, at least researching for these biographies. Their intention is to provide a who is who, not to do real biographical research. This brings a twofold result. On the one hand, bibliography is generally old and not much updated, but this is the lesser problem. On the other hand, because the authors are no real experts, such biographies show a common tendency. They incorporate any possible information available with no attention to discrepancies and to errors. In other words, they tend to reconcile questionable points, rather than to challenge them and possibly correct them. This case is not unique. I have already mentioned that in the Biographical, we actually find several so-called Italian heretics. They were born in Italy but ended up in the Grisons, in Moravia, in Poland. Their entries are written by scholars who hardly do new archival research, nor they have access to specialized bibliography written outside Italy. And when they have access to it, generally, they can't read it. The result is identical to the Swiss colleagues. In the best cases, the biographies are old. In the worst case, they are full of inconsistency. And this is the problem. They are full of new mistakes because they combine old ones. The situation is similar, and I would say worse, when we come to linguistic minorities. Let's see the Vergerio brothers. Now I have to run because I have very little time left. Let's see. Apparently, so no Slovenian, no Croatian work is mentioned, and they have long bibliographies. Apparently, no Bertosha wrote, nor Primorsky, Slovensky, Biografsky Lexikon was ever published. But this is not just bibliographical issues. This creates problems. Let's see. For Giovanni Battista, this means that the best sketch at the moment existing, the one written by an Italian scholar but in Croatian and published on the Istarska Encyclopedia, is absent. It's not taken into account. So the entry is based on Stankovic, a work of middle 19th centuries. And as for Pierpaolo, the absence of this bibliography means that the tensions between Pierpaolo and Primož Strubar are not mentioned at all in the entry, nor the problem, which is a relevant biographical problem, of which kind of Southern Slavonic the Vergerio's brother spoke and where they learned it, how they learned it, at which degree of complexity. The complexity of the Vergerio brothers has vanished from the Dizionario Biographico degli Italiani. I'm about to conclude. Allow me to try to make a point. I do lament that linguistic and religious minorities are not given enough space in the Dizionario Biographico. But this is only half of the problem as I see it. As soon as we realize that these minorities existed and that they played a role in a certain historical context, we should do our best, now I speak as biographers in general, do our best to assure, to recognize, even to stress the complexity of their existence, as well as their possible eccentricity to the main historical and national tradition in which they actually put. How could it be achieved? How can we reach to this point? The easiest solution is to ask foreign colleagues. to write entries on some of these characters, accepting the risk that they are not going to say something we might like. But then there is a real historiographical problem. When we ask colleagues to write, foreign colleagues, the bibliographies are written, generally are not in our language, the articles that are mentioned. So which is the use of, let's say, an Italian biography of one of these characters with an all or almost all Slovenian and Croatian bibliography? I would prefer it, but this poses a problem. But that I would be glad to discuss, and I was discussing it, but now I have to finish. So leaving aside this possibility, which has very much to do with the anthropological problem of how we deal with minorities. Do we want them raw or we want them boiled? We want a minority that speak our language, or we still want a minority that don't speak our language? How we deal with them as really different from us, or as a domesticated minority? The other solution is a regional solution. It's we forget the national dimension and we deal with a regional dimension. We write works that have a regional dimension, possibly like the Swiss have taught us, we publish them in all the languages spoken in the area. The editorial board, in an ideal situation, has two or as many editorial groups as the main language involved, and they participate in writing these regional works, which, as I mentioned, the Istarska Encyclopedia is the best thing that has appeared on early modern Istria. Still, there is a potential downside. By adopting a regional point of view, these regions, these border regions, that would naturally end up being regarded as marginal in the history of the main nations that of those history these nations are part. From vibrant areas where different people, different confessions, and different languages mixed, they turned up as eccentric peripheries. Maybe this is the price that must be paid to have them studied properly. Yet, it seems to me a very high price indeed. Then I'm sorry I have no happy ending for you today, but thank you very much for your time.